Think about pulling on your favorite t-shirt, or maybe wrapping yourself in a cozy blanket. Seems simple, right?
Yeah, pretty basic stuff.
But the journey those textiles take and, their final price, it's
Mhm.
all getting tangled up in tariffs. And the unpredictability of it all is really sending ripples through the economy.
It really is.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're zeroing in on exactly that, how this tariff uncertainty is hitting the economic landscape. We'll use the U.S. textiles industry as our main case study. It's quite revealing.
And for this exploration, we've got a really interesting mix of sources. There's an analysis from a factoring specialist that gives us a good sense of the financial pressures kind of in real time.
Okay.
We also have a study guide, which is great for the historical background and the basics. And then there's a briefing document that pulls together the main arguments and policy stuff.
So the mission today is really to unpack all that complexity. We want to figure out how the ups and downs of tariffs in this sector tell us something bigger about economic vulnerability.
Exactly. We're trying to get to the heart of how that instability, that uncertainty plays out.
Right. Because tariffs might sound a bit abstract, maybe a dry policy thing, but the instability, that translates into very real effects for businesses and for you, the consumer.
Definitely.
So maybe let's set the scene first. Let's look back at the history between tariffs and U.S. textiles. It wasn't always about protection in the way we think of it now, was it? Sometimes tariffs were actually meant to help it grow.
That's a really key point. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you go back to the 19th, early 20th centuries, the U.S. textile industry was, well, it's just getting started.
The new kid on the block.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And to help these new domestic mills compete, especially against established players like Britain,
Right.
the government used high tariffs. Think of it like giving them a protected home market to get stronger.
Like training wheels, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And it worked.
Yeah.
The American textiles industry really flourished back then because of that approach.
Okay, so tariffs as a growth engine initially. But then the whole global picture started to change, right? Trade liberalization came along.
Precisely. Things like GALE, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, its whole point was basically reduce tariffs everywhere through negotiation. And then came the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and regional deals like NAFTA.
Right.
These just fundamentally changed the game.
Mm.
For textiles, it meant markets opened up, and suddenly there was huge pressure from countries with much lower production costs. Our study guide really emphasizes this point.
We're talking China, India, Vietnam, Bangladesh.
Exactly. Those became the textile powerhouses. And that protective bubble around the U.S. industry, it started to deflate pretty quickly, actually.
Which I imagine led to a lot of pressure on the domestic industry. Mills closing, job losses.
Huge pressure. Significant headwinds, as they say. And inevitably, that led to calls for, well, protection again, for new tariffs, other measures to try and stem the tide of those lower-cost imports.
Okay, so we've seen this arc. Protection, then opening up, then calls for protection again. Let's dig into the arguments for tariffs now. In today's world, with all this uncertainty, what are the potential upsides for U.S. textiles?
Well, the big one, and you hear this a lot, especially in regions where textiles are still a major employer, is jobs. Job preservation.
Places like the Carolinas, Georgia.
Exactly. The Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama. The industry is deeply rooted there economically. So the argument is tariffs make the domestically produced stuff more price competitive against imports. That could potentially stop more jobs from disappearing in those towns.
So it's about keeping those manufacturing jobs going. That's a clear argument.
It's a very powerful one politically and economically in those specific areas.
Beyond just holding on to existing jobs, though, are there other ways tariffs might help the industry navigate this uncertainty and maybe look towards the future?
Yes, absolutely. Another argument is that tariffs can create a bit of breathing room, a window for domestic companies to reinvest, maybe innovate.
Yeah.
Well, if they're not constantly fighting against the absolute rock-bottom global prices, maybe they have the capital, the confidence to upgrade their machinery, adopt more automation, or focus on developing higher-value stuff.
Like specialized textiles.
Exactly. Think
Yeah.
about advanced materials, fire-resistant fabrics, maybe high-performance textiles for the military, or even specialized medical textiles. Those things often need more sophisticated manufacturing. Tariffs might give companies the space to move in that direction.
So it's not just protecting the old, but maybe encouraging a shift to higher tech, higher value products, things that compete on more than just price.
That's the idea, yes. Competing on value, not just cost.
And we've all heard so much about supply chains lately, vulnerabilities, disruptions. How do tariffs fit into that conversation? The uncertainty there seems huge.
That's become a really big point, especially after the last few years. Tariffs can be seen as an incentive for reshoring, bringing production back home.
To the U.S.
Right. The idea is that boosts supply chain resilience.
Ah.
If more textiles are made here, companies are less dependent on suppliers halfway around the world who might face disruptions, political instability, shipping problems, you name it.
So quicker access to materials, more reliability, especially for essential goods, I guess.
Particularly for strategic sectors, yeah.
Okay.
Having that domestic base reduces a certain kind of uncertainty, even if the tariffs themselves create another kind.
Interesting trade-off. What about sustainability and ethical production? Consumers seem to care more about that now.
They certainly do. And tariffs can intersect with that, too. Often, U.S. producers have to meet higher environmental standards, stricter labor laws, compared to some competitors.
Okay.
So tariffs can help, let's say, level the playing field a bit. It allows domestic producers to highlight the made in the USA aspect, the higher standards, and appeal to consumers who are willing to pay a bit more for something they see as more ethical or sustainable.
So it helps them compete on those values, not just the price tag. Less uncertainty about the conditions of production, perhaps?
Potentially, yes. It offers a different kind of competitive edge.
Okay, so we've laid out a pretty strong case for tariffs, job protection, innovation space, supply chain resilience, promoting sustainability. But like you said, it's a trade-off. There have to be downsides, right? Hidden costs, risks, especially with the uncertainty they introduce.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely a double-edged sword. One of the most immediate impacts, the one most people feel directly, is the potential for higher prices.
For consumers.
For consumers, yes. When tariffs make imported clothes, shoes, home textiles more expensive, those costs usually get passed on. So you end up paying more at the register.
And that probably hits some people harder than others.
Definitely. Lower-income households tend to spend a bigger chunk of their budget on necessities like clothing and textiles, so they feel the pinch more acutely. The uncertainty hits their budget directly.
Right. So protecting one industry might mean a bigger financial burden for lots of households. How else does this tariff uncertainty ripple outwards?
Well, think about other industries using textiles. U.S. apparel companies making clothes here, furniture makers using upholstery fabrics, even car manufacturers using textiles in seats and interiors.
Okay, the downstream industry.
Exactly. If tariffs raise the cost of their essential inputs, the fabrics, the yarns, it squeezes their profit margins. It can make them less competitive, maybe even globally. And that uncertainty about input costs makes it really hard for them to plan and invest.
Wow, so it really is a chain reaction. Uncertainty in one spot creates instability elsewhere.
It definitely can. And we haven't even talked about the international response yet.
Retaliation.
Retaliation, absolutely. Tariffs rarely exist in a vacuum. Other countries often hit back. The recent trade dispute with China is a perfect example.
What happened there?
Well, the U.S. put tariffs on lots of Chinese goods, including textiles. China responded with tariffs on U.S. goods, notably agricultural products like cotton.
Cotton. But isn't that key for the textile industry itself?
Exactly. So it hurt American cotton farmers, and it disrupted the supply chain for U.S. textile manufacturers who rely on that domestic cotton. It just added another layer of cost and, crucially, unpredictability. The whole system becomes less certain.
So the very tool meant to help can end up causing harm through these knock-on effects. It really amplifies the uncertainty.
It certainly can.
Is there also a risk that relying too much on tariffs kind of stops the industry from tackling deeper problems?
That's a really critical concern highlighted in our sources. Tariffs might feel like a relief, a temporary shield, but they don't magically fix underlying issues like maybe higher labor costs compared to some places, or the constant need to invest in new technology just to keep up.
So it's like a crutch.
It could become one. If the industry gets too comfortable behind the tariff wall, it might delay making those really tough but necessary long-term investments in innovation, efficiency, finding new markets. And that dependence on a policy that could change with the next election or the next trade negotiation creates its own kind of deep-seated uncertainty.
That makes a lot of sense. You're just swapping one kind of uncertainty for another, maybe even a more fundamental one. Okay, so bringing us closer to today, what's the actual situation now with tariffs on textiles?
Well, the Trump administration imposed significant tariffs on Chinese textiles, ranging from 10% up to 25% on various goods.
And the impact?
It was pretty mixed based on our sources. Some U.S. manufacturers did see a bit of a bump, yeah. Buyers started looking for alternatives to China, so they got some new orders.
Okay.
But many others just faced higher costs for the materials they needed to import, or they had their existing supply chains totally disrupted. So it wasn't a clear win across the board. It created winners and losers,
Yeah.
and definitely more uncertainty overall.
And has the Biden administration changed course significantly? Has that uncertainty lessened?
Not really on this front. For the most part, those tariffs on Chinese goods have stayed in place. The administration talks about strategic competition with China, about needing more resilient domestic supply chains. Those are the main justifications.
So the policy continues, more or less.
Yes. Which you could argue provides a kind of predictability. Businesses know the tariffs are there now. But it still leaves everyone operating in this environment shaped by trade barriers, and always wondering if or when the policy might shift again. The underlying uncertainty about the future of the tariffs remains.
So this climate of tariff uncertainty isn't just theoretical, it's the daily reality for these businesses. And it sounds like tariffs are just one part of a bigger picture, a bigger economic strategy shift.
Exactly right. It's not happening in isolation. You also see these broader trends efforts to work closer with allied countries, big government investments trying to boost domestic manufacturing. Think of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Cheap FPS Act.
Right, promoting semiconductor production and
Yeah.
green tech.
Yeah, and also more emphasis on Buy American rules for government purchasing.
Yeah.
All these different policies bump up against each other and interact with the tariff situation in really complex ways. It makes the whole landscape even more intricate and, frankly, sometimes more unpredictable for businesses trying to navigate it all.
Okay, so given this really complex, uncertain environment, it sounds like just relying on tariffs isn't a sustainable long-term plan for U.S. textiles. Where does the industry go from here?
Well, the consensus view, certainly from the sources we looked at, is that the industry's long-term health really depends more on its ability to innovate and adapt, much more than on tariff protection, which, as we've established, can be pretty volatile.
So innovation is key. What kind of innovation are we talking about?
Think about things like smart textiles fabrics with embedded sensors or electronics, or developing really high-performance materials for specialized uses, maybe in aerospace or medicine. That's where the U.S. often has a research advantage.
Playing to existing strengths, then. Moving up the value chain where price isn't the only factor.
Exactly. Competing on technology and performance, which is less vulnerable to those sudden tariff shifts.
What else? Are there other promising areas beyond just high tech?
Definitely. Sustainability and ethical production, we touched on that. There's a real opportunity to capitalize on that growing consumer demand, especially in premium markets, making it a selling point.
Okay.
Then there's potential in things like customization, using digital tools for faster design, maybe more localized production, for quicker turnaround times, speed to market, and finally, really focusing on niche markets. Finding specific areas where U.S. producers can lead based on quality, unique features, specialized capabilities, rather than trying to compete head-on with mass-market imports purely on price.
So finding those pockets where they can offer something unique, something valuable, and building from there, that seems like a way to reduce the vulnerability to tariff uncertainty.
It's about building resilience based on inherent strengths, not just external protection.
Which makes tariffs sound more like maybe a temporary tool, something to provide breathing space for this kind of transformation, rather than a permanent wall.
That perspective certainly comes through in the briefing document we read. Tariffs can offer some short-term stability, maybe help fund some of that investment and innovation, but they probably shouldn't be seen as the end goal or a permanent shield. The real uncertainty, perhaps, is whether the industry can use any breathing space effectively to make that shift.
Right. So let's try and wrap this up. It seems really clear that tariffs on textiles, they create this incredibly complex web, lots of unpredictable economic effects.
Certainly.
There are potential short-term benefits, sure, especially for specific regions or companies, but also really significant risks and costs. Higher prices for you, the consumer, pressure on other industries, trade disputes. It all feeds into this climate of economic uncertainty.
And looking ahead, while tariffs might hang around in some form, the long-term success for U.S. textiles and probably many industries really seems to lie more in innovation, in adapting to what the global market actually wants, leading in specific high-value areas, rather than just relying on trade protection policies that can change on a dime.
That leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. We've seen how interconnected things are just within textiles and related sectors. So how might the uncertainty around tariffs in one area, like textiles, create completely unforeseen challenges or maybe even unexpected opportunities in parts of the economy that seem totally unrelated? It's just a reminder of how deeply intertwined everything is in the global economy and why understanding these trade policy dynamics, especially the uncertainty they create, is so crucial for navigating the future.